In the winter of 1943, the citizens of Berlin were becoming accustomed to a nightly ritual of terror. The thunderous drone of hundreds of RAF Lancaster and Halifax bombers would begin. The sirens would wail, and the city would brace for the inevitable rain of high explosives. But another sound had begun to haunt them, one that was almost worse in its psychological effect. It was the sound of a lone aircraft, impossibly fast, appearing over the capital in broad daylight or in the dead of night, long before or after the main raids. It would drop its bombs and vanish before the flak guns could even find its range. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, was said to fly into a rage at the mere mention of it. He famously fumed, "It makes me furious when I see the Mosquito. I turn green and yellow with envy. The British, who can afford aluminum better than we can, knock together a beautiful wooden aircraft that every piano factory is building and give it a speed which they have now increased yet again." He wasn't wrong to be angry. The aircraft he was talking about, the de Havilland Mosquito, was more than just an irritant. It was a phantom, a wooden ghost that flew too high and too fast, systematically dismantling the most sophisticated air defense system the world had ever seen. The Germans had built a wall in the sky over Europe, a network of radar, searchlights, and night fighters so methodical and deadly that it was grinding Bomber Command's offensive to a halt. They called it the Kammhuber Line. And the Mosquito, an unarmed bomber made of plywood and glue that the Air Ministry had initially rejected as a useless toy, was about to prove that the wall was made of paper. This is the story of how an aircraft born from a rejected radical idea didn't just survive against the German defensive shield, but actively outsmarted it, blinded it, and ultimately broke it, proving that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the one with the thickest armor, but the one that simply refuses to play by the enemy's rules. To understand how the Mosquito achieved the impossible, you first have to understand the machine itself. And to understand the machine, you have to understand its creator, Sir Geoffrey de Havilland. By the late 1930s, the consensus in military aviation was absolute. The future was metal. Heavy bombers were to be flying fortresses, bristling with gun turrets, protected by thick armor plate, and built from stressed skin aluminum. The idea of a wooden combat aircraft was seen as a laughable step backward, a return to the era of biplanes and canvas. But de Havilland saw things differently. He wasn't just an aircraft designer, he was a master of wooden construction. His company had built its reputation on aircraft like the Comet Racer, a sleek wooden monoplane that had won the 1934 Macrobertson Air Race from England to Australia. De Havilland understood a fundamental truth that the military bureaucracy had missed. Wood, when engineered correctly, could be lighter, stronger, and more aerodynamically efficient than metal. In 1938, as the storm clouds of war gathered, de Havilland approached the Air Ministry with a proposal so radical it was met with polite disbelief. He proposed a bomber with no defensive armament whatsoever. No gun turrets, no tail gunner, not even a single machine gun. Its sole defense would be its speed. It would be constructed almost entirely from a composite of balsa and birch plywood, bonded with casing glue. It would be powered by two of the new Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same power plants destined for the Spitfire and Hurricane. His calculations suggested this unarmed bomber could reach a top speed of nearly 400 miles per hour, faster than any fighter currently in service with the RAF, let alone the Luftwaffe. It could carry a 1,000-pound bomb load to Berlin, drop it, and be home before German interceptors could even get to altitude. The Air Ministry rejected the idea flat out. Their doctrine was built around the heavy bomber, the belief that formations of well-defended aircraft could fight their way to a target in daylight. An unarmed wooden plane, regardless of its supposed speed, was seen as a suicide machine. Furthermore, Britain was ramping up production of aluminum for its new metal fighters and bombers. Reverting to wood seemed strategically backward. But de Havilland was persistent. He argued that his wooden wonder would have a crucial strategic advantage. It wouldn't compete for the same scarce resources. While the Spitfire and Lancaster factories consumed every available sheet of aluminum and every skilled metal worker, his Mosquito could be built in furniture factories by cabinet makers, piano builders, and coach builders. It was the perfect shadow production aircraft. Reluctantly, in March 1940, with the war already underway and the need for any and all aircraft becoming desperate, the Air Ministry gave to Havilland a small contract to build a prototype, primarily for reconnaissance duties. They still didn't believe in it as a bomber. The prototype, W4050, first took to the skies on November 25, 1940. The results were not just good, they were breathtaking. In official trials, the aircraft, still unpainted and laden with test equipment, hit 392 miles per hour. It was faster, more maneuverable, and could outclimb the Spitfire that was sent to chase it. The wooden toy, the aircraft nobody wanted, was officially the fastest operational aircraft in the world. Pilots who flew it were astonished. They described its handling as light and responsive, more like a fighter than a twin-engine bomber. The wooden wonder, the aircraft nobody wanted, was born and arrived at exactly the moment the RAF was facing its deadliest challenge, a German air defense system that seemed, for a time, to be invincible. By mid-1941, RAF Bomber Command was in crisis. Their strategy of sending waves of heavy bombers, Wellingtons, Whitleys, and Hamdens, against German industrial targets at night was failing. The losses were becoming unsustainable. On some nights, 5 to 7% of the attacking force would fail to return. An aircrew's chance of surviving a 30-mission tour was statistically less than 50%. The reason for this slaughter was a meticulously engineered German defense network known as the Kammhuber Line. Named after its architect, General Joseph Kammhuber, the line was a masterpiece of command and control. It was a belt of overlapping defense zones, stretching from Denmark down through the Netherlands, Belgium, and into eastern France. Each zone, or box, was a cube of airspace roughly 20 miles wide and 12 miles deep, stretching from the ground up to the stratosphere. At the heart of each box was a ground-controlled interception site, codenamed Himmelbett, or four-poster bed. Each Himmelbett site operated 2 radars. The first was a long-range early warning radar called Freya, which could detect the approaching bomber stream from over 100 miles away. As the bombers entered the box, the Freya operator would hand off a target to a second, more precise radar. This was the Würzburg radar. Actually, there were 2 Würzburgs. The first, the bomber Würzburg, would lock onto a single RAF bomber, tracking its course, speed, and altitude with terrifying accuracy. In the same control room, a second fighter Würzburg would lock onto the zone's assigned night fighter, typically a Messerschmitt Bf-110 or a Junkers Ju-88, which was circling a radio beacon nearby. The ground controller, watching 2 glowing dots on his displays, had one simple job: to give the night fighter pilot verbal instructions, turn left, climb, descend, until the 2 dots merged. At that point, the night fighter, equipped with its own short-range airborne radar, or simply relying on the pilot's eyes, would be directly behind and slightly below the unsuspecting British bomber. The result was almost always a kill. The bomber crew would often die without ever knowing what hit them. This system was brutally effective because it was so methodical. It filtered the chaos of a 100-bomber raid into a series of single, manageable engagements. 1 box, 1 fighter, 1 bomber. Once a kill was made, the fighter would land to refuel, while another took its place, ready for the next bomber to enter the box. For the RAF, it was like flying into a series of invisible, electronically guarded walls. Their heavy bombers were too slow to evade the system, and they flew in predictable streams that made them easy targets for the Freya radars.
The Kammhuber line was a meat grinder, and in 1942 it was at the peak of its efficiency. Bomber Command was bleeding out, and they needed a way to break the system. The Mosquito was not the obvious answer. It was fast, but the Kammhuber line wasn't about a chase. It was about geometry and calculated intercepts. However, the Mosquito possessed two qualities that, when combined, turned it into the perfect key to unlock Kammhuber's rigid system: its speed and its altitude ceiling. The first Mosquitoes to challenge the line were the bomber variants of 105 and 139 squadrons. When they were integrated into the main bomber streams, German controllers were baffled. A typical Lancaster flew at around 200 miles per hour. A Mosquito flew at over 350 miles per hour at the same altitude. The Würzburg radar operators would lock onto a Mosquito and the controller would begin vectoring his night fighter. But the speed difference was so great that the calculations were impossible. The German night fighters, the Bf-110 and UJ-88, were simply not fast enough. By the time the controller guided the fighter to the predicted intercept point, the Mosquito was already 10 miles away, crossing into the next box. The entire ground-controlled interception cycle, which took several minutes to execute, was too slow to catch an aircraft moving at nearly 6 miles a minute. The Mosquito was literally outrunning the system on the ground. Frustrated, the Germans tried to position fighters ahead of the Mosquito's path, but this too failed. The Mosquito crews, flying alone or in small groups, could make small, unpredictable changes in heading that threw off the intercept geometry completely. They weren't tied to the slow, rigid course of a heavy bomber stream. Then came the high-altitude reconnaissance Mosquitoes of the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit, or PRU. These were stripped-down, unarmed versions, painted a special PRU blue for camouflage against the sky. With pressurized cockpits and modified Merlin engines, they could operate at altitudes above 30,000 feet, sometimes pushing 35,000 feet. The German defense system simply broke down at these heights. The Würzburg radar's accuracy degraded significantly at extreme altitude and long range. Even if they could get a lock, most German night fighters struggled to operate effectively above 25,000 feet. Their engines lost power in the thin air, and their maneuverability became sluggish. A Mosquito at 35,000 feet was, for all practical purposes, untouchable. It could fly over the heart of Germany in broad daylight, photographing sensitive targets, and there was almost nothing the Luftwaffe could do about it. The wooden wonder was flying over the fight, not through it. But the Mosquito's most devastating contribution was yet to come. It wasn't enough to simply evade the Kammhuber line. Bomber Command needed to destroy it. In late 1942, the RAF formed the Pathfinder Force, an elite group of crews tasked with flying ahead of the main bomber force to mark targets with colored flares, known as target indicators or TIs. The Mosquito was the perfect aircraft for the job.
Flying minutes ahead of the heavy bombers, a handful of Mosquitoes would streak across the Kammhuber line. They were too fast to be reliably intercepted, but their appearance on German radar screens would trigger the entire defensive response. Night fighters would be scrambled. Controllers would focus all their attention on these first few contacts, and the whole system would become fixated on the phantom-like intruders. And then, just as the main bomber stream arrived, the Mosquitoes did something that turned the German air defense system from a precision weapon into a useless, blinded giant. They deployed Window. Window, known today as chaff, was an absurdly simple yet war-winning invention. It consisted of bundles of aluminum foil strips cut to a specific length to match the wavelength of the German Würzburg radars. When dropped from an aircraft, these bundles would disperse into a cloud of millions of tiny reflectors, creating a massive, chaotic echo on the radar screen. A single Mosquito could drop enough window to create a radar return larger than a 200-bomber formation. The Würzburg operators, who had been tracking a single clear dot, were suddenly faced with a screen full of snow. They couldn't distinguish the real bombers from the thousands of false echoes. The ground controller couldn't tell which dot to follow. The entire Himmelbett system, so reliant on locking onto a single target, was rendered instantly impotent. The first large-scale use of window occurred during a massive raid on Hamburg on the night of July 24, 1943. Mosquito pathfinders went in first, dropping both their target-marking flares and the first bundles of window. As the main force of Lancasters and Halifaxes followed, they too dropped window. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the Germans. The controllers on the ground watched their screens dissolve into meaningless noise. The night fighters, deprived of their ground vectors, were forced to hunt visually in a sky filled with smoke, clouds, and now thousands of phantom targets. Bomber Command's losses on that raid dropped to just 1.5%. The Kammhuber line, as a systematic defense, had been broken in a single night. The Mosquito was the key. Its speed and altitude allowed it to get in, sow the electronic chaos with window, mark the target, and get out, paving a safe corridor for the slow-moving heavies that followed. It wasn't just an aircraft, it was an electronic warfare pioneer. With the German night defenses in disarray, the Mosquito was unleashed in a role that would cement its legendary status, the nuisance raider. Throughout 1943 and 1944, a small force of Mosquitoes from 105 and 139 squadrons began a relentless campaign of psychological warfare against Berlin itself. Almost every night, a handful of Mosquitoes, sometimes just one or two, would make a high-speed run to the German capital. They carried a single 4,000-pound cookie bomb, a massive blockbuster bomb that the Mosquito, incredibly, had been modified to carry. The physical damage from a single bomb was minimal in a city the size of Berlin, but that wasn't the point. The point was that the Mosquitoes could get there when nothing else could. They arrived at unpredictable times, forcing the city's air raid sirens to sound, disrupting sleep, and shattering the myth of the inviolable capital. Berliners began to suffer from what they called Mosquito panic. The constant random alarms meant that a full night's sleep became an impossible luxury. Factory production was interrupted as workers were sent to shelters. Morale, already cracking under the weight of the main bomber raids, began to crumble. The Mosquito's ability to appear over Berlin seemingly at will drove Göring to distraction. The Luftwaffe was forced to pull vital resources, elite night fighter squadrons, and hundreds of 88mm flak guns away from the eastern and western fronts to defend Berlin from just a handful of wooden aircraft. The Mosquito was tying down a disproportionate amount of Germany's war machine. Perhaps no mission better illustrates the Mosquito's unique blend of speed and precision than the raid on the Gestapo headquarters in Oslo, Norway, on September 25, 1942. The British Special Operations Executive had learned that the Gestapo was about to torture and execute key members of the Norwegian resistance. A conventional bombing raid would have been too inaccurate and would have killed the very prisoners they were trying to save. The job was given to 4 Mosquitoes of 105 Squadron. It was a daylight, low-level raid over 450 miles of hostile territory and open sea. They would have to fly at treetop height to stay under German radar, navigate precisely to a single building in the center of a city, and drop their bombs with surgical accuracy. Flying at over 300 miles per hour, just 50 feet above the waves, they made the crossing to Norway. They screamed up the Oslo fjord, their Merlin engines roaring, and appeared over the city with less than a minute's warning. The lead aircraft put its bombs directly into the front of the Victoria Terrace, the Gestapo building. The following aircraft hit the same target. The building was devastated. Gestapo records were destroyed, and in the ensuing chaos, many resistance prisoners were able to escape. Though tragically, the raid also caused civilian casualties in a nearby building. The 4 Mosquitoes turned for home, pursued by German FW-19 fighters that had been scrambled too late. Even with the Germans in hot pursuit, the Mosquito's speed was its salvation. They simply opened the throttles and outran the German fighters, returning to base safely. The mission was a stunning demonstration of what the aircraft could do. It had flown a 1,000-mile round trip,
delivered a precision strike in the heart of an occupied capital and outrun the Luftwaffe's best fighters. The de Havilland Mosquito was a paradox. It was an aircraft born from an idea that everyone thought was obsolete, built from materials everyone thought were weak. It was a bomber with no guns, a fighter that could carry a 4,000-pound bomb, and it was the weapon that single-handedly outsmarted the most formidable air defense system of its time. It succeeded not through brute force, but through intelligence. Its speed and altitude made it a ghost in the German machine, a variable that Kammhuber's rigid, methodical system could not compute. It exposed the fatal flaw in the German defenses, a reliance on a single, predictable method of interception. The Mosquito was anything but predictable. It served as a pathfinder, a night fighter, a day bomber, a reconnaissance platform, and a psychological weapon. In every role, it excelled because of its fundamental design philosophy that speed is armor and that an enemy cannot shoot down what he cannot catch. The German pilots and radar operators on the ground weren't fighting a mere aircraft, they were fighting a concept. While the Lancasters and Halifaxes delivered the crushing blows that leveled German industry, it was the Mosquito that picked the lock. It flew ahead, blinded the sentries, and created the chaos that allowed the heavyweights to do their work. The Wooden Wonder, the piano factory bomber, proved that in the complex, technological warfare of the 20th century, the most powerful weapon is not always the biggest or the strongest, but the one that is simply too clever to be caught. The Germans had built a shield, but de Havilland had built a rapier, and in the deadly skies over the Third Reich, speed and wit proved to be the sharpest weapons of all.